investors are seeing that. I think policymakers are also seeing that more and more. Solar is the lowest cost power generation source today, and it's getting still cheaper.
2020 has been a surprising year for the European solar industry. Contrary to many official predictions in the beginning of the pandemic, the solar-powered technology industry just had its second best year in history. So how did this happen? Which factors enabled the industry to be so resilient? How did the markets change in the past months? And which countries benefited the most? Find out more in the next roundabout 20 minutes. Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there. Today I welcome Michael Schmela as the expert for this episode. He's an executive advisor, the head of market intelligence and a member of the leadership team at SolarPower Europe. However, some of you already might know him as Sunny Bloke, a dedicated blogger for all things related to solar power, and of course as the managing director and founder of Taiyang News, a digital solar news platform. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Zakis. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
I'm very glad to dive into the topic because it is a very positive topic. So your very own team, Michael, in the beginning of 2020, when the pandemic hit off, predicted that it would be a tough year for the solar power technology industry. And now, with hindsight, and I think you will share some numbers in just a moment, we can say it's been the second best year in history. So how did this happen? And are you positively surprised?
As you said in the intro, solar grew quite a bit. So in fact, the newly installed solar power in the European Union increased by 11% to 18.2 gigawatt in 2020. That means not only did demand for solar PV systems in the EU grow at all over the course of a year. That was defined by the pandemic, and I think this is noteworthy at all. But even more surprising is that it increased by double digits to a level that, as you mentioned before, marks the second best ever in EU solar history. When you look back 6 months ago or so, there was probably not a single, at least I'm not aware of, there was not a single analyst who forecasted such a positive outcome. That includes us, and especially when considering the fear that a second wave might be haunting Europe in autumn and the winter. But still, and I think this is also important to mention, it wasn't all rosy for solar in 2020. The pandemic also has impacted solar demand, and according to our early forecast, it was 12% less. In fact, actually, we had changed our view in early spring, and at that time, we thought that the market would decrease by 10%. So the 12% we see now is, again, even if I repeat myself, a very big positive surprise.
Well, thanks for sharing these exciting numbers. What do you think were the defining factors to support this resilience and this double-digit growth? And are these factors still in place for 2021?
Actually, it's only getting better. Solar is showing a steep cost reduction curve. Already last year, we had reached levels in most European countries where solar was cheaper than other power generation sources. And so it made simply sense to invest. And obviously also for bigger power plants and larger commercial industrial scale rooftop systems, these are investment decisions that were taken. And if you can, you simply go ahead. That actually really simply shows that a lot of people, investors, are counting on solar, are seeing its attractiveness and are simply going ahead. What also played in the hands of solar, that despite partial lockdowns or even severe lockdowns for a certain amount of time, the markets still continued. So in Germany, for example, craftsmen continued to work over the course of the whole year. And in other markets where work actually completely stopped on building power plants for a while, that continued then later. Obviously, as I mentioned, solar didn't grow as much as we had anticipated, but much more than we feared. And that's simply due to the reasons that installers continued doing their job.
At this point, a quick shout out to our partner of this episode, which is Mounting Systems, one of the biggest German manufacturers of state-of-the-art PV racking systems. The product range of Mounting Systems include all kinds of rooftop installations as well as solar carports and tracker systems. With 9 gigawatt of installed capacity in over 50 countries, Mounting Systems are proud to be a part of the global movements toward an emission-free and green future. Mounting Systems is more than a system, it's a brand. Now, based on the experience of 2020, what would be your forecast for this year, for 21?
The surprisingly positive 2020 will be actually followed by many growth years to come. So in our EU market outlook, we forecasted a market of 22.4 gigawatt in 2021. So significantly bigger than last year. This would be then also an all-time high for the European Union, beating the decade-old 21.3 gigawatt record from 2011.
So you're very confident that in this year we will surpass the all-time high. And what do you think then will be the market going forward? Will this be a steep curve going forward in 2022, 3, 4, 5, and for the next 7 years?
Yes, actually, we are even more upbeat because 2021 we hope to have overcome the pandemic completely. So we project even over 27 gigawatt in 2022 and even exceed the 30 gigawatt level in 2023 with close to 31 gigawatt. This would translate into 15 to 18% higher deployments than we originally thought in the 2019 five-year market outlook. And if we go to the last year of this five-year outlook that we just published, we see Europe even to cross the 35 gigawatt level. So that means we would really see that over 115 gigawatt will be installed until 2024.
Well, these numbers certainly make us happy here in the context of the Smarter E. If you look at that with a pie chart angle, I think usually Germany is one of those countries who make up for the largest share of that pie. Is that the same this year?
As we forecasted, Germany became in 2020 again the largest solar market in Europe. And that's a position it has held for, I think, 3/4 of the last 2 decades. I think in the last 20 years, so Germany was for 14 times the largest market, which is interesting when you consider the climate in Germany. On the other hand, it's the strongest economy and also the country with the largest population. I think what we will see if you look at Germany, we are pretty upbeat that Germany also will stay at the top for the coming years. Recently, the EEG, the Renewable Energy Law, was revised, so it's not all great what's in there. I think there could have been a lot of things done much better, but in the end, actually there were some changes done accordingly to what the sector had asked for, and we believe that the market will also be Europe's number one in 2024.
All right, no surprises with regards to Germany's share of the pie. What's the situation like if you look at the countries following up, or maybe even the countries in the midfield? Have there been any changes in the dynamic and the growth rates?
What's interesting is that if you look at 2020, so the number 2 was Holland. They moved up 1 rank to the second place after installing 2.8 gigawatts, so considerably smaller than the 4.8 in Germany, but still impressive if you look at the size of the country. And number 3 was the 2019 market leader, Spain, which added around 2.8 gigawatt. So that was also to be expected, simply because Spain in 2019, when they had been a market leader after a long time, profited from tender-based systems that had to be installed. There was a clear deadline. There was no other deadline in 2020 for any new tenders. So that's why the market went down again. But still, I think it's very positive what we've seen in Spain, simply because much of this growth was from subsidy-free solar systems, and that also shows once again the attractiveness of solar power. I think the most surprising country was Poland. They were the 4th largest market, and most people rather associate Poland as the European Union's coal bridgehead, where hard and lignite coal represent around 75% of power demand. But next to that, they are really looking into solar and have installed over 2 gigawatts. So that's more than double than the year before. And we see Poland to stay a very attractive market. So if you kind of look at the top 5, then the last in this group is France, which installed around 900 megawatts, so not even touched the gigawatt level. And that was pretty disappointing. France has actually pretty big plans, but somehow, and that's mostly administrative barriers, that's preventing it from these plans becoming reality.
Well, that's interesting to hear about Poland. I guess also that reflects, if I'm correctly informed, is that they've been quite eager to benefit from the Green New Deal in the EU, and also have the Green New Deal help them to transition from coal to more renewable energy. So I guess then that is now positively reflected in the PV growth.
Well, that's too early to say what the Green Deal mean for Poland. I think they were objecting many of the high targets the European Commission was proposing, but obviously Poland will be one of the big beneficiaries of the recovery money that's combined with the Green Deal and will be used also to approach the Green Deal targets. But it's too early to say. I think for the moment it's simply Poland has to obviously do something. They had their 2020 targets, like all the EU members, all the other EU member states as well. And they chose simply solar, simply because it's so cost effective and so easy and quickly to install.
So when listening to you, on the one hand, on the current dynamic, but also on the outlook for the solar power market, one could get the impression that really all is well in the world of solar power. Double-digit growth, an amazing outlook. So what's the effect of these positive news? And are there still some issues left, if any, that the industry needs to overcome?
Well, I think the positive thing is that we are realizing at SolarPower Europe that solar is increasingly getting on the radar of European policymakers. So when you look back in 2020, so 22 of the 27 EU member states have installed more solar than the year before. That compares to 21 out of 28 in 2019. So I think that's actually a positive development. What's also encouraging is that in 2019 already more solar capacity was installed than for any other power generation source in the EU. And that was probably true for 2020 as well. It's also great that basically all EU member states have recognized solar in the national energy and climate plans, the so-called NECPs. That's where they outline how they want to reach the EU 2030 targets. And yet now comes the big but. But the ambitions are much too low. We need much more solar, and we need much faster growth. So if you look at these NECPs, the member states have outlined that they want to install in average close to 20 gigawatts a year. So that's basically the level that was installed in 2020 with around 18 gigawatt. And that was the year of Europe's most severe economic crisis in the last few decades. So there needs to be much higher ambition. With SolarPower Europe, we've shown in our 100% Renewable Europe report, which we published last year, that in order to comply with the Paris Agreement, the volume of solar the EU must install is at least 2.5 times higher than the expected NECP totals by 2030.
So if I translate into the numbers, 2020 would have not needed to be at around 18 gigawatt, but it would have needed to be around 50 gigawatt.
Well, I think you have the 10 years, so at least you this is a dimension you have to go for. So basically we need to be at 50 gigawatt or even more, depending on what you want to reach, better even 70 gigawatt in order to comply to Paris and go 100% renewables by 2050.
All right, well, that's quite a steep curve. And in order to get there, then, what would be your recommendations for policymakers on how EU member states can accelerate solar deployment?
Well, in the end, it's all about the right framework conditions, because mentioned several times, and investors are seeing that. I think policymakers are also seeing that more and more. Solar is the lowest cost power generation source today, and it's getting still cheaper. So that means if you compare all the cost curves of the different power generation technologies, nothing is showing cost reduction curve that is as steep as for solar. So it's only getting better in terms of cost efficiency. But we need actually a level playing field for that to happen. And in order to push solar, obviously one measure we could use for speeding up the technology is the EU's recovery plan, the Next Generation EU. That's ambitious investment plan, and that really tries to mitigate, on the one hand, the impact of the pandemic, but at the same time accelerating Europe's green and digital transition. The solar industry as the most sustainable and job-creating energy source appears to be a perfect candidate to contribute to this challenging transition towards making Europe carbon neutral and support the recovery.
So let's hope that policymakers really seize that almost once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here that this crisis offers in this regard. If we open our scope and we look at the global situation, what kind of repercussions do the election results in the US have for the solar market here in Europe? Obviously, Biden won the election. His approach to renewables starkly differs from Trump's approach. Does this have an effect on the markets here, a positive effect maybe?
It's actually obviously great news, but even under Trump, solar also was quite resilient due to its economic attractiveness, and also with many US states still supporting solar. The technology fared quite well in the recent few years. But with Biden, of course, there will be completely different opportunities because he is visionary and will see solar as one of the growth pillars. Now that the US will return also to the Paris Agreement, one of the first actions he promised to do in his election campaign. The US is one important pillar for the solar industry, but we're seeing the momentum actually happening globally. China, which also recently said that they want to go carbon neutral by 2060, so 10 years later, then Europe is the largest solar market in the world, or we can also expect much faster growth in China in the coming years, so that if we look around the world at the biggest markets, the weather forecast is completely sunny.
Well, if that isn't a wonderful outlook to conclude our joint session here, Michael, what are my key takeaways from your insights so far? Of course, 2020 has been an amazing year for the solar industry. However, the factors behind it will stay and are here to stay probably for the coming years and decades, which is that solar power just has become increasingly cost efficient, beating almost any other power source out there. And this means that we can expect 2021 already to crack the all-time high of gigawatts being installed in Europe in the year 2011. And from there on, what you said it yourself, every year we'll see a significant growth rate in the number of gigawatts being installed in the EU. However, this is no reason to give it some slack and to relax, because we're still far behind the growth rate we need if we want to meet our ambitious climate goals in 2030 and 2050. Then we really need to multiply our efforts by the factor of 2.5. Still, it's an overall very positive dynamic. All we just need to hope for is that legislators and policymakers pick up on that dynamic and give it an additional boost. And we are in good company if we look at the global situation. China is hot on our heels in this regard with similarly ambitious goals, and the US just has taken a positive turn as well. Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Thanks, Takis, for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Stay tuned for more episodes of the SmarterE podcast. You can find more information about what's happening in the PV markets in Europe as well as worldwide at the Intersolar Europe conference. Infos can be found online at intersolar.de/en/conference.